Hello, my name is Mark Young. I'm the Editor-in-Chief of Historical Biology, and together with the editorial board, we'd like to talk about making academic publishing open and fair, how MorphoBank aids data reproducibility. For any scientific field to progress, data fundamentally must be shared between researchers, and different researchers should then be allowed to verify these findings and then build methods that allow them to further knowledge. As you're all no doubt aware, open data describes a specific way of making data accessible to researchers and to readers. Data should be stored in a repository under an open license, making it equivalent to an open access article. Whereas fair data is an inspirational term outlining best practice for preserving research data. The principles of fair data are that it's findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. The benefits of open data are that anyone can view and use the data regardless of institutional access. Researchers from underfunded institutions and countries can fully participate. Open datasets and matrices are reused and cited more often. Freely available data enables faster, broader scientific progress. Teachers and students can explore real data in classrooms, and open data allows others to reproduce and validate results. Now, FAIR data is an acronym for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. With findability, IDs should be persistent and the metadata should be searchable. For accessible, the licenses should be open with minimal barriers. To be interoperable, there should be standardized formats. For phylogenetic data, this could be Nexus format or TNT format, and there should be a vocabulary for the metadata. And for reusable, there should be documentation provided, provenance data, and appropriate licenses. The best way to make licenses appropriate is the use of the Creative Commons attribution license, either CC BY or CC equivalents can be applied to any dataset, allowing them to be reused by any third party for any lawful purpose. Now, it's important to note that data should only be shared if it is ethical to do so, where it does not violate the protection of human subjects or any other valid ethical, privacy or security concern. One acronym is CARE principles, CARE, C being for collective benefit, the A being for authority to control, R for responsibility, and the E for ethics. When it comes to depositing data, it must be done so in a way that is put into a recognised repository. Now, these mint persistent digital identifiers, such as the DOIs. Data should also meet fair data principles. Now, in principle, there is a lot of support for fair data, as many journal editors do recognise the importance of fair data, and there's strong conceptual support for the deposition and transparency. However, in practice, it can be quite hard to implement, as there's additional hurdles for authors during the submission process, and sometimes there is a perceived disincentive compared to journals without such requirements. And perhaps more importantly, enforcement is inconsistent or perhaps even absent due to limited editorial capacity for verification and for competing editorial priorities during the editorial process. To give an example of such challenges, when data is deposited or it's only partially fair, there can be issues with data quality and usability, such as non-standard style file formats, which limits interoperability, incomplete data sets such as missing key files or missing metadata, and perhaps most often there's a discrepancy between the paper that's actually uploaded and the data itself. So what is historical biology? Well, we are a paleontology journal. We focus on evolutionary and systematic biology through time. We accept publications on any taxonomic group. And recently we've had a leadership change. I took over as editor-in-chief at the end of last year. And since then we've been evolving our aims and scopes, pushing the journal towards a more open and ultimately open and fair direction. In order to do this, we're developing new article types, all of which are now available for submission. These include registered reports, method, data notes, as well as other article types. Our science communication editor has been leading new initiatives, such as our social media platforms and writing a monthly science communication editorial series. Historical biology is a hybrid open access journal. We have both traditional and open access publishing options. We have free online publication options available, and we support preprints as well as green open access. We are committed to transparency and accessibility in research. Some of our changes include using the credit taxonomy for authors to list who did what in their papers, as well as who was the handling editor of each article. And we also believe in the adoption of best practices for data management. In order to ensure that we can support our authors in the best way possible, we have a series of new specialist editors. This includes our data editor, phylogenetics editor, ethics editor, science communication editor and book review editor, as well as 2 new deputy editor-in-chiefs. We do this so we can now support our authors in reproducibility and replicability studies, as well as supporting authors in their data management best practices, such as recommending MorphoBank as well as other online repositories. As I previously mentioned, we do now support pre-registered studies through the submission of registered reports. We can handle this directly, or we can also support peer community in registered reports. One of the biggest changes that we're making is the strengthening of our data sharing policy. Initially, when we took over, we had the basic data sharing policy, in which authors were encouraged to share their data or to make them open, but there was no requirement for it to do so. From April of this year, we changed to share upon reasonable request. One of the changes this made was data availability statements became mandatory. However, from January of next year, we'll be transitioning to being publicly available, at which point data must be made publicly available via online repositories. This has to have a persistent identifier for the data, and there must be a data citation in the paper itself. And then from 2027 and then into 2028, we'll be making the transition to open data, and then eventually into open and fully fair. One of the first big steps we made this year in order to become an open and fair journal was making data availability statements mandatory. Previously to this, there was no requirement for these statements. At the moment, we also don't have data citations being mandatory, but this will change from January of next year. Now, this caused some issues initially as the transition over to these statements didn't happen smoothly, which is one of the reasons why we're taking quite a slow approach each January from going to publicly available to open and then finally to open and fair. This way we can have our internal workflows working quite well, and we can support our authors in making these changes. Although historical biology hasn't yet moved to being an open and fair journal, authors are starting to use MorphoBank to deposit their phylogenetic data. So far there are 14 projects related to their publications in historical biology. In order to encourage authors to use MorphoBank and to make their data as open and fair as possible, our data editor, Dr. Brooke Longvox, published a data note in historical biology on a phylogenetic data set on bivalves. In there she described what a fair data set looks like, and it's our hope that as we move up our data policy changes, that this will become the standard for all phylogenetic data sets published in historical biology. In conclusion, I'd like to advocate everyone join the open science movement and to submit their phylogenetic work to MorphoBank, and if interested also submit to historical biology. Also, if there's a possibility of engaging with open science initiatives, I would strongly recommend them. And for historical biology, please do follow our updates on registered reports and our data policy changes, as well as look out for updates from our editorials, the first of which are already out. Thank you for listening, and if you have any questions, please do reach out to myself or any other member of the board.